Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video podcasts that are going to go over the main points for our next class. There are three main objectives that we're going to go over in the podcasts for today. The first one is the unifying themes to be alive. That is, in essence, what is life? What are the characteristics that must be present in anything that is living? Then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about relating the organization of living systems from molecules to the biosphere. And lastly, I want to talk about the science of biology. So let's go ahead and begin with this first objective and identify the unifying themes to be living. The first is that all living things are made up of a single cell or multiple cells. The next is a living thing must have the ability to replicate itself or reproduce would be another way to say that. Third theme is that anything that is alive must be able to process information. In essence, what we're talking about here is DNA. That makes up all of the different genes found in something that is alive. The fourth is that anything that is alive has to be able to use energy. They have to make energy, they have to be able to use energy to break down things. And then the last theme of life is evolution. Anything that is alive is the product of evolution. And those things that are living are still evolving. Now what I'm going to do is spend a little bit of time with each of these five. So let's start with the first one. So I'm going to say life is cellular. So let's begin with what is a cell. Well, the term itself was first coined by Robert Hooke in 1665. He was able to make a very rudimentary microscope and he looked at the structures of a cork and he noticed small little compartments in that cork and he thought they kind of looked like cells found in the monastery. So he coined the term cell. So he's the first one to observe a cell and he was the one that coined the term cell. But what really is a cell then? So you certainly have seen a picture of something depicting a cell, and so we know that all cells have to have a plasma membrane. All cells have to have DNA. Now this DNA may or may not be inside of a nucleus. Not all cells have a nucleus, but all cells have DNA. All cells have to have these small structures here, which we'll call ribosomes. Ribosomes, just to remind you, are structures in the cytoplasm that are required in order to make proteins. And the last thing that all cells must have is a cytoplasm. And I'm just going to draw that like so. Some cells, as we'll learn, have structures inside the cytoplasm that are not necessarily common to all cells. The minimal compartments of a cell include the plasma membrane, the ribosomes, the cytoplasm, and the DNA. So another question here is, where did this cell come from? Well, this cell here came from a pre-existing cell. And I'm going to make it a little smaller just because I didn't leave myself enough room. But this cell divided to create 2, maybe 4 new cells. I'm just going to draw 2 here. So all cells come from a pre-existing cell. It's important for us to address this next topic because we didn't always know that cells came from cells. So let's write these 2 competing hypotheses. The first is that cells came from a process called spontaneous generation. And the other hypothesis was that cells come from pre-existing cells. This one over here later became known as the cell theory. This one over here, cells arising from spontaneous generation, was that up until, say, the mid-1800s or so, many scientists believed that cells could spontaneously form under the right conditions. And the hypothesis that cells arose from pre-existing cells essentially says, as the statement claims here, that in order to have this cell here, there had to have been an original cell that gave rise to it, that it could not form spontaneously, that it required a pre-existing cell. To determine which of these two hypotheses was most supported, a scientist which you've probably heard of, Louis Pasteur, performed an experiment that ultimately showed that cells do come from pre-existing cells, and that gave rise to the cell theory. And what I want to do on the next whiteboard is go over that in a little bit more detail. Okay, so let's go ahead and go into this experiment that Louis Pasteur did to determine whether cells arose by spontaneous generation or from pre-existing cells. The experiment he did is as follows. He took a flask. Let's just draw a flask like this. And the flask had growth media in it, but no cells, just the media. He also took another flask, and this flask had a funny shape to it. And he also put media in this flask. He then boiled the media, and the reason he boiled the media was to make sure that there were no cells in the media. So essentially he sterilized the media. And let's focus on this top row first here. After he boiled the media, he added bacteria. And this top flask, what happened was, once he added bacteria to the media, he saw growth. So starting off with sterile media, then adding cells to that sterile media allowed the cells to grow. Now, you could argue that it wasn't just because the bacteria made it grow. Maybe there was some other things in the media that allowed it to grow. And it would have happened even without the bacteria. Or maybe something from the air could have floated in there and that allowed it to grow. So that's why he did the following experiment below. Again, he took the media in this funny looking flask here, boiled it. When he boiled this, what would happen is condensation occurred and he'd get a little bit of media here. So now when he adds the bacteria, he doesn't add the bacteria to the bottom of the flasks. He adds the bacteria to this little bit of condensation there. So the only way that bacteria could grow in the flask, the bottom part of the flask, is if cells could arise by spontaneous generation. And what Louis Pasteur discovered when he did this experiment was that in the main part of the flask, there was no growth. So from this and subsequent studies, the idea that cells come from pre-existing cells was supported. And over time, the cell theory was established. And the cell theory contains three main principles. The first is that all living things are composed of one or more cells. The second principle here is that cells are the basic unit of life. And the final one is that all cells arise from pre-existing cells. Now let's move to our second theme of what makes a thing a living thing, and that is that life reproduces itself. Your book says life replicates itself, and so I'll put that underneath here. Either are acceptable. And we can think of this in a few ways. You can think about this as, say, like a yeast cell here dividing. When it divides, it buds and produces two new yeast cells. This initial yeast cell replicated itself or reproduced to produce two new cells. I could also think about it from a multicellular organism. And so let's think about a human. From my amazingly descriptive drawing of a human here, my drawings will continue to amaze you throughout the semester. So two humans, or two organisms of any kind, can reproduce to produce an offspring, right? Or maybe multiple offsprings. We can also think about it from the sense of the cells dividing within a multicellular organism. So let's take a fertilized zygote. So that's an egg cell, an oocyte. has been fertilized with a sperm. And so this fertilized egg here, as I said, is called a zygote. Now, this is one of the things that got me the most geeked about biology when I was learning it as a student. That you go from this one fertilized egg, this zygote, and through many divisions, and we'll talk about these divisions in later classes, like in cell biology and some advanced classes, but all the information you need to create the fully grown organism is contained in this one cell. And through many millions, billions of cell divisions, you go through this process to create this human, and this organism here continues to divide and replacing old cells, diseased cells with new and healthy cells. All because life reproduces itself from a single cell to 2 cells to 4 cells to 8 cells to 16 cells to well over 1 trillion cells. So life reproduces itself. Now next, let's talk about the third unifying theme of life, and that is life processes information. And so I left the drawing down here for just a moment because this is the thing that's really amazing. So how does this fertilized zygote know how to become a fully formed human? How does a fish zygote know to become a fully formed fish? How does a daffodil zygote know to develop and become a daffodil? It's all because life processes information. It's because the DNA in the zygote contains all the information necessary to go through embryonic and fetal development and to become a fully formed organism. All that information is in that tiny cell. It's pretty amazing. And so, of course, this wasn't something that was just magically known. It was discovered through time. And when you take genetics, biology 211, you'll learn more about the process and the history of learning how DNA is the genetic material. But what I'd like you to know for now is what this chromosomal theory of inheritance is. And this theory essentially states that chromosomes are the vehicles of genetic heredity. So if this is a chromosome here, we know, and you'll learn more about this later, that there are many genes found on the chromosome. So gene 1, gene 2, and of course this is very simple. Most chromosomes contain hundreds or thousands of genes on them. These genes then code for, ultimately, proteins. And the proteins that are coded essentially are the traits that we see. Every trait you see is typically the protein that is being expressed. So this is the chromosome theory of inheritance. So the next thing I want to talk about is something called the central dogma. And when you take genetics, you'll learn this in great detail. But essentially, the central dogma is that DNA, and more specifically, the genes on the DNA, are converted into RNA. And this RNA is converted into protein. This is what the central dogma is. And there are many more details to it, and you'll learn about that later. And you'll also learn that there are some exceptions to the central dogma. But for now, I'd like you to know simply that the central dogma takes DNA and converts it to RNA, which then is converted to protein. And to emphasize that the proteins that are produced give rise to our traits. So without this central dogma happening, there would be no way to go from a single zygote to a fully formed organism. Okay, let's move on to our fourth unifying theme, to be alive, and that is life requires energy. I redrew the drawing at the bottom here because I think it really helps understand the concept of why life requires energy. Everywhere from the fertilization of the egg by the sperm to the formation of the zygote to the many cell divisions that occur to create the fully formed organism, and then for that fully formed organism to continue to live and exist requires energy. So let's think about this energy in a little bit more detail and say that organisms have 2 key nutritional needs. The first is that they need ATP. And you've probably heard of ATP when you took high school biology and maybe some other courses. But what this is it's chemical energy that helps drive chemical reactions in cells. And we'll spend quite a bit more time talking about ATP in other courses like cell biology. But essentially what you should know is that ATP has a lot of energy in it, and it can transfer that energy to reactants in order to make certain products. So let me just draw that last part out just a little bit, just so it's clear what I meant. Reactants are the things that exist before the reaction with the help of ATP, and sometimes it's other kinds of chemical energies. It could even be heat, but in this case we're going to say ATP produces some kind of product. The other nutritional need that organisms require are molecules that can make larger macromolecules. These larger macromolecules include proteins, nucleic acids, which would be DNA and RNA, carbohydrates, and lipids that help make up membranes. Okay, and that's all I'm going to say about life requiring energy. Let's move on to our last unifying theme of life, and that is that life evolves. We're going to talk a lot in this class about evolution and how life evolves. So let's go ahead and introduce some of the key points of how life evolves. And so let's begin our discussion of evolution by talking about the two claims that Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace made in 1858. And the first is that all species are related by a common ancestry. The second is that characteristics of species can be modified from generation to generation. So let's go ahead and provide a definition of evolution. And we can think of this as a change in characteristics over time. And ultimately, when we say there's a change in characteristics, what this really means is a change in allele frequency. When you take genetics, you're going to use this word allele a lot, and even in this class we're going to use it a lot, so I think it's important that we define what we mean by an allele. So an allele is one of two or more alternative forms of a gene. You may remember from a biology class in high school that everyone has two copies of every gene. So I may have two copies of a gene for eye color, but that doesn't mean that those are the only two possible copies of that gene. Since we know that in a population of individuals we'll see multiple colors of eyes, we know there has to be more than just those two forms of the gene that I have. So those different forms of the genes that allow for blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes, hazel eyes, red eyes, whatever color eyes they are. We know in order to achieve that, we have to have more than two alleles or more than two different copies of that gene. So an allele is just one of multiple forms of a gene that is in a population. And so again, you can think of evolution as simply a change in allele frequencies over time that provides new and different traits. Another term I'd like to define is natural selection. This is a term we're going to use quite a bit this semester, and so let's go ahead and talk about what natural selection is. So natural selection occurs when both of these conditions exist. And the first is that individuals in a population, and a population is just a group of individuals of the same species. So individuals in a population vary in heritable characteristics. And this second thing that has to occur for natural selection is that in certain environments, some of these heritable characteristics help individuals survive. Now, it doesn't always have to be a trait that would appear to be a trait of strength and power. It might be something that has some other disadvantages, but for that particular environment, it has an advantage that allows survival. And when that organism survives, then that characteristic is passed on, and then you will see that characteristic increase in percentage within that population. And we'll talk about examples of this as we move into some of the fundamentals of evolution. There are two more terms we should review here. The first is fitness. In our everyday language, we think of fitness as being, say, physically healthy, physically strong, physically powerful in some way. And within evolution, fitness is the ability of one individual to reproduce viable offspring more efficiently than other individuals in that population. As I said on the previous whiteboard, this doesn't mean the individual is stronger or more powerful. It just means that they are able to reproduce more efficiently and therefore are able to create more progeny, which then causes that trait to be found in that population at a higher percentage. The last word I'd like to define for you here under Life Evolves is adaptation. When we use adaptation in many circles of our lives, we think of it as the way we adapt or change in new situations. In biology, we think of adaptation as something a little different. We think of it as a heritable trait. And as I'm going through this, I just realized I've been using this word heritable. And in case you're not sure exactly what I mean when I say that, this just means passing it on from one generation, from parent, say, to child. We consider that a heritable trait. So this adaptation is a heritable trait that increases the fitness of an individual in a particular environment. The last thing I want to talk about is try to connect the idea of molecules being ultimately responsible for everything we see in the biosphere, or what we might just say as Earth. Let's begin here with atoms, the many different elements we have, and how these atoms can combine to form molecules. And how these molecules can now become larger molecules and help form a living cell. And then how these cells can combine to form a tissue, which is just a collection of cells, of the same cells, forming a particular function. So let me write tissue here. And maybe just as an example, this is lung tissue. But it's not a lung, it's just the tissues of it. These tissues then can combine with other tissues, many other kinds of tissues, to form an organ. And maybe in this case it is the actual lung as the organ. And up here, remember, that was just lung tissue. So an organ is a collection of those different tissues. And then different organs can now combine to form an organ system. So in this example here, this might help form the respiratory system. And then ultimately, these organ systems in an organism can lead to the formation of the organism. When you have a collection of these organisms, so if it's an elephant, and now you have multiple elephants come together, we call that a population. Population is just a collection of the same organism. So when you think of this population, say a bunch of elephants, and so when you think of everything that those elephants interact with, the trees, birds, other animals, bacteria, other plants, all together makes up a community. So a community is just within a particular area, all the different animals and living things that are present there. And again, thinking about community, that's just including the living organisms in that area. But when you include everything in that area, that particular space, We call that the ecosystem. So the ecosystem would include all living, which we would call biotic, and all non-living things in that particular environment, so we would call that abiotic. And then finally, when you take all of these ecosystems and combine them, you'll end up with the biosphere. So biosphere, again, is nothing more than a collection of all the ecosystems found on Earth. So the main point I want you to get from this whiteboard is that all life on Earth, from a single cell all the way to the entire biosphere, requires the smallest fundamental unit of an atom, and how those atoms combine in ways to form cells and then all the way through here. So I want you to understand that basic principle. You should also know the order: atoms, molecules, cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, organisms, populations, community, ecosystems, biosphere. For this quiz that you'll take, I will not ask you to define any of these terms found on this whiteboard, but you should know the order of them. Okay, let's move on to a different topic here, and that is the science of biology. So let's begin with thinking about the essence of what it is to be a biologist. So biologists, in a very general sense, investigate questions about living things. In doing so, biologists will observe, measure, and collect data. Biologists also will form a hypothesis and collect evidence that either supports or refutes the hypothesis. So in a very general sense, this helps define what a biologist does. And obviously there are many intricate details that separate the many different types of biologists out there, but these are the fundamentals that link all biologists. Next, I'd like to talk about the scientific method, and I am confident that you have seen the scientific method in one or multiple classes, either in college or in high school. But it's important to kind of begin with this so that we're all on the same page when we think about setting up an experiment. The first step of the scientific method is making observations. These could be observations you've made yourself, or they could be observations made by other scientists that you know about. So if we think about this from the Louis Pasteur experiment we talked about earlier, the observation might be that Pasteur observed cells' ability to grow in media. The next part of the scientific method would be to define the problem or question. So in Louis Pasteur's experiment, the question might be, can cells grow without pre-existing cells present? The next part of the scientific method would be to form a hypothesis or state a hypothesis. So the hypothesis in this case from Louis Pasteur's experiments might be cells can form spontaneously. And then the next part of the scientific method would be to design the test or experiment, you might say. So in Pasteur's experiments, the experiment he set up was to see if bacteria could grow in a regular flask versus a flask where the cells could not enter the main part of the media. Then the next part of the scientific method would be to collect the data, analyze the data. And so if you remember from Louis Pasteur's experiments, the data that was collected refuted this hypothesis that cells can form spontaneously. So here we're going to say data does not support the hypothesis. Now, regardless of what the outcome is, the data that you collect, does it refute or does it support the hypothesis? It will always lead to making more observations, generating more questions, more hypotheses and more experiments. Okay, so I spent a lot of time here talking about a hypothesis and testing a hypothesis and such, but we often hear the word theory used quite a bit. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. So a hypothesis and a theory. So we might think of a hypothesis as kind of an assumption based on observations before an experiment is done. We can think of a theory as something essentially much stronger than a hypothesis. But theories are principles that explain scientific phenomena already supported by a large body of data. So you wouldn't just say, I tested one hypothesis and therefore it is now a theory. It has to be this collection of, say, many different hypotheses that have been tested and continue to support the general principle that is being tested. Often, these data can come from multiple disciplines. So, for instance, the theory of evolution is supported by biological data, chemical data, anthropological data, and many other sources of data. So some examples of theories would be certainly the theory of evolution, the cell theory that we talked about, theory of relativity, germ theory of disease, and we'll end with the Big Bang theory, because that's one of my favorite shows. All right, that's all I think I want to say about hypotheses and theories. I'd like to end this podcast with just a real quick summary of everything we've talked about. We talked about what it means to be alive, and in that we talked about the 5 different themes of life. And those 5 themes, to remind you, were cells, meaning that all life exists as a fundamental unit of the cell. Reproduction or replication. For something to be alive, it has to have the ability to reproduce. All life has to be able to process information. All life has to be able to use energy. And the last one was that life evolves. The second thing I want to remind you is that we talked about how atoms are ultimately responsible for all the living things we see in the biosphere. And we went into much more details about it, and you can review those notes to remind yourself. And last, we talked about the science of biology. What biologists study, the questions we ask, and then we talked about the scientific method. All right, that's all I have for this podcast. If you have any questions at all, make sure you come see me or send me an email. And if not, I'll see you in class. Bye for now.